the migration of African Americans into the state. Only 4 counties out of Indiana's 92 had voted against the constitutional amendment. One of them, Randolph, was a county that had experienced a significant migration earlier in the century of those Quakers out of North Carolina. That marker is just a block this way. How many of you know the Benjamin Benson marker? It's right there on February 1 Plaza, and names those 3 Quakers and some of that history. Several years ago, when a number of us were arguing before the city council to keep a big stretch of the historic New Garden Woods, Guilford College Woods from being developed, we talked about some of this history in front of the city council, the mayor and the city council members. Not a one of them knew any of that history. And I've been surprised in this year's events of the bicentennial of the Underground Road, how few in Greensboro know the richness of the history that's right around the corner here. Much of it buried there in that little jeweled cemetery. Well, one more, again, to make that connection of folk who later on continued some of this work. And some of you know these people. James Floyd, Pete Moore, and Lucretia Moore. I mean, you know those folks. Pete Moore and Lucretia Phillips Moore have simple epitaphs on their plain stones in the New Garden Cemetery. Lucretia's reads, "Help us to be good, kind, patient, and loving." Pete's is, "Walked cheerfully, found God in everyone." The inscriptions are certainly appropriate. Pete, long a professor in Guilford College's Religious Studies Department, broadened student horizons in the classroom and beyond, avidly promoting knowledge of the worldwide community, particularly of Friends. Many students from around the world came to the college because of his efforts, and they became a part of the Moore family on campus. Pete and Lucretia invited Kenyan students to their home to celebrate that country's independence in the 1960s. In the 1990s, they invited Palestinian students they had taught decades earlier to the Guilford College campus for a reunion. From 1946 to 48, Pete took a leave of absence from Guilford to serve with Lucretia at the Ramallah Friends Schools in Palestine. When the 1948 war broke out, the family was evacuated, and the Moores served with the American Friends Service Committee's relief efforts in Gaza. The first efforts in addressing the refugee crisis there before the United Nations stepped in. When the Quakers realized this wasn't just a temporary refugee situation, they said, we don't do long-term stuff, we deal with emergencies. They stepped aside, and the United Nations Relief and Welfare Association was formed to help address that. Pete then went on to Germany to help continue AFSC relief efforts for women and children following World War II. Pete wrote a letter in 1953 to Guilford's Board of Trustees calling for integration with the Quaker College. The conservative members of the board, however, were hesitant to get out in front of the culture and continued to deny admission to applicants of color. Stymied by the college, Pete and Lucretia continued their advocacy of integration by joining other Quakers in advocating for the integration of public schools. A group of them wrote a letter to the newspaper calling for implementation of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling, a move which cost some of the signees their jobs. Businesses such as Mackey Furniture lost customers and had to close. Any of you know where Mackey Furniture was? It's now the Firestone store across from Quaker Village. But finally, in 1957, Greensboro Senior High School was integrated. After attending Boston University for 3 years to earn his PhD, while serving and living in the Lynn Friends Meeting House, Pete and the family became avid Red Sox fans. Pete often used his interest in sports and attendance at football, baseball, and other athletic events to reach and motivate many of his students through the years. He was very proud to earn the 12th Man Award from Guilford's football team. He was about as effective as the 12th man as the other 11. When students at North Carolina A&T State University and Bennett College, 2 historically African-American colleges in Greensboro, organized sit-ins in 1960 at the segregated Woolworth's lunch counter, Guilford's administration discouraged students from joining in the protests. Several ignored the admonition, however, and some were jailed for their civil disobedience. Pete took the family's mortgage papers downtown to use as collateral for bailing the students out. The three children, Abigail, Randy, and Doug, asked their mother, "What's a mortgage?" Guilford College remained segregated into the early 1960s, but Pete continued to work for admitting non-whites. It took strategic thinking. Knowing that the soon-to-retire president of the college, Clyde Milner, was anxious to win the honor of hosting the 1967 World Gathering of Friends in Greensboro as his going-away present, Pete knew this was the opportunity to push integration. Worldwide Friends, nearly half of whom live in Africa, how many of you knew that? Half of them live in Africa, would not agree to meet on a segregated campus. Together with Milner, Pete went to Kenya to press their case for Guilford with the Friends World Committee for Consultation, sponsored the gathering, assuring them that the issue would be resolved. Indeed, in 1962, 2 Kenyan Quakers were enrolled at Guilford. And later that year, the first African-American student was admitted to the college. Embarrassingly late for a Quaker college, but still ahead of the culture. Guilford secured the invitation to host the World Gathering, and Pete took a sabbatical from his teaching to help organize and coordinate it. To the end of his days, Pete continued to send friends notes on stationery from the 1967 conference. How many of you got notes on that stationery? Pete and Lucretia's home in the Guilford Woods, Pixie Hill, was a place of hospitality, not only for international students, but also for college seminars, well-known Quaker visitors, and for the faculty families nearby. Although Pete was often asked to speak at various events in the Greensboro area and in Quaker circles, it was Lucretia's careful listening and thoughtful, quiet service that led to her being asked to be the clerk of ministry and council for a New Garden Friends meeting. Near the Moore's home stands a mighty poplar tree in the old-growth section of the campus woods. More than 300 years old and the second largest tree of its type in the state. How many of you seen the Underground Railroad tree? Massive. It's a massive tree. It is the heritage tree of Guilford County. It was a silent witness to the activities of the Underground Railroad that occurred in the New Garden Woods. And the tree was particularly prized by Pete and Lucretia. And they made sure that the tree's story was told and that it was protected. They were involved in the effort to keep I-73 from going through that section of the woods. It would have been destroyed had the Department of Transportation had their way. Through their commitment, the tree has become to symbolize the college's core values. Loving, walking cheerfully, and seeing God in everyone. Strong, mighty, witness to important history. Like the tree, that seems to describe Pete and Lucretia. Gertrude has some.
Well, as you know, this was Max's book, really, but I got involved. I really was just helping him and hoping I was doing enough to get a free book. But I have this one, The Underground Railroad in Guilford County. I have some copies with me. I don't know that I'm supposed to sell them here, but anyway.
I need one, so yeah.
Well, anyway, we'll work that out later. But that's kind of how I got involved, and that's how we got Deanna involved, is because she had done this. This is sold out. We had 350 copies of it. We now have 500, and I think we've sold about 500. So we still have a few, but we sold out of the first printing, and it's because Deanna helped us so much and did such a nice job. She's done other work for Friends as well. I don't really plan to read any of mine, but I do want to share some personal history with a couple of them. First one I said I wanted to put in was David Sampson and Sarah Sally Sampson. And my mother was a Sampson. Now David died in 1916. My mother was born in 1919. She never knew him, but she heard stories about him all her life, and he was a cousin. But the significance about him is that he was a blind preacher, and he started Winston-Salem Friends Meeting among many other Friends meetings. And you can read all about what he did. He was originally from England, but you can read all about what he did in the book. the thing about my essays, you'll tell immediately, you don't even have to look at who wrote them. You'll be able to tell that mine are a little more biographical. His are funny. But mine are just more.
Hers are actually true.
I was trained as a historian, and there you go. So anyway, but it's about David and about Sarah, who was his second wife. And so Mother always called her Cousin Sally. Well, I saw where everybody called her Cousin Sally, whether she was their cousin or not. But she taught in the Guilford Primary School, and she was one of Mother's teachers, in addition to being part of her family. And she was quite a bit younger than David and lived on until 57. So, you know, I did know who she was, barely. But I heard Mother talk about David, you know, kind of all her life and how proud she was of this part of her family. And we have many Sampsons that have gone through New Garden Friends Meeting. So anyway, and then I got to researching, you know, all these people, and I would go on Ancestry.com, and I would look in the minutes we have in the Friends Historical Place. It's now called the Quaker Room. But one thing I found was a newspaper article about her in the early 50s. She's going to take a trip to California, and this merited a newspaper article and a picture. So anyway, that was one of the ones that I said I wanted to immediately put in. And let me see the other one, if I can find it. Is the Haworths. You know, there's Haworths and Hayworths, but this was Haworth. I don't know that I'm going to be able to locate it here in the book real fast. Should be near Pete Moore's because they're buried practically together. But anyway, I'll just tell about them. Samuel Haworth and Evelyn Haworth were friends of my family, very close family friends. And the reason why they were so close is that my parents were the last couple that Samuel Haworth married.